Okay, it's recording now. Okay, if you have the slides, we're going to start further down in the slides and then go back to the earlier. That's to try to save a little time because we only have right now 4 days this week. And that's going to be if we can go all the way to the end of the day on Thursday. So we'll see. So we're actually going to start on slide 43. And this week we're going to be focusing a lot of our time on different genres or literary types of literature in the Bible. In the previous course, I taught you a basic method for preparing an expository sermon. Now, I'm not going to teach you a new method. I'm going to teach you to modify that method in light of the uniquenesses of certain types of biblical literature. The method I taught you works really well with teaching passages in the Old Testament, New Testament. Works well with all of the epistles. Works well with the teaching passages from Jesus in the Gospels. Works well with Old Testament teaching blocks, such as the final speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy, final speech of Joshua in the book of Joshua. It can work well with the prophetic speeches from the speeches or sermons from the prophets. And it will work with many other types. The parables of Jesus, the narrative sections in the Old Testament, New Testament. But you have to just be careful how you're working with the text. You can't treat each type of literature in exactly the same way. So our basic plan is to walk through a type of literature. To talk about what are the unique things or the unique characteristics of that type of genre. Then talk about what does that mean about preaching? How should we modify our preaching a little bit to deal better with that genre? And then we're going to work with one or two texts from that genre. This is what you should do. This is what you shouldn't do with that particular text. I hope you have as much enjoy as much studying this as I did preparing it. This is totally new material for me. You're the first ones I've ever taught this material. But as is the case with many of my materials, it's something I've been thinking about for years. I just had never put it together on paper. So if you're looking, we are starting on slide 43, and now we're moving to slide 44. So I want you to understand, genre is a fancy sounding word. I think in English we stole it from French. Because it sounds more like a French word, not like an English word. But when it comes to biblical text, it means the following.
Երբ խոսք գնում աստվածաշնչյան տեքստերի մասին, այն հետևյալն է նշանակում։
These are texts or biblical passages
Սրանք տեքստեր են, աստվածաշնչյան հատվածներ,
that are similar to each other in the following ways.
Որ նման են իրար հետևյալ ձևերով։
They're similar in form,
Իրենց ձևով,
content,
կոնտենտով,
function, and
գործառույթով
structure.
եւ կառուցվածքով։
So when you're looking at these separate genres, you need to think about those four things: form,
Երբ նայում
content,
ես
function, structure.
Ժանրի, պիտի հետևյալ բաների մասին մտածենք՝ իր ձևը, կոնտենտը, գործառույթը եւ կառուցվածքը։
Now, these different genres don't change reality.
Տարբեր ժանրերը չեն փոխում իրականությունը։
Reality is reality.
Իրականություն է։
But it's just they're different lenses through which we look at reality. We analyze reality.
Ոսպնյակներ են, հա, որոնց միջոցով նայում ենք իրականությանը։
The epistles look very detailed at specific things in reality.
Նամակները շատ դետալացված կերպով են նայում իրականությանը։
The Psalms don't look that detailed. They want you to see the whole picture.
Սաղմոսները այդքան չեն կենտրոնանում դետալների վրա, այլ ուզում են ընդհանուր պատկերը տեսնել։
Some of them are designed to pass on very specific information.
Նրանցից ոմանց նպատակն է շատ կոնկրետ ինֆորմացիա փոխանցել։
Some of them, like the prophetic literature, is designed to produce a specific effect.
Դրանցից ոմանք, օրինակ, մարգարեական գրականությունը ուզում են կոնկրետ էֆեկտ ունենալ։
And basically,
ապաշխարեք։
the message of all the prophets you could pretty much summarize in the word repent.
Մարգարեների բոլոր ասածների հա այսպես ամփոփել ուղղակի ապաշխարեք։
But the thing we have to keep remembering with these genres is what is said can't be separated from how it is said. To understand what is said, you have to come at that text from the perspective of how it is said. The Psalms are poetry. So they're not going to go, they don't have this distinct, clear logic. But they do use structures and forms designed to create a certain effect.
And
we'll talk about this later. The biggest structure for effect in Psalms is parallelism. Where one part of a verse is somehow structured and in order to be tied with the second part. But to understand the first and the second part, you have to take them together and see how they relate to each other. This will sometimes also happen in Proverbs, as well as in other places. And in the Bible, truth is always communicated through a literary form. There is not a single biblical verse that is not written in a particular form. And it really, when we look at all these forms, it reminds you that God likes diversity. He didn't leave us a boring instructional manual. But he left us apocalyptic literature and prophetic literature and narratives and songs and by doing that, the Bible addresses all the different phases of life and all the different emotions that we could ever encounter in life. And you can have two biblical texts. They both discuss the same theme, but they don't do it in the same way. You know, even When you look at the Exodus, how the people were brought out of Egypt,
Նույնիսկ երբ նայում ես ելից գրքին, հա, թե ինչպես են ժողովուրդը Եգիպտոսից դուրս գալ։
look at the description of what happened.
Նկարագրությունը թե ինչպես դա տեղի ունեցավ։ Նույն իրադարձությունն
flavors.
նկարագրությունը իրենց նյուանսները, իրենց առանձին ամն։
So what do? How does that impact preaching?
Ինչպես է սա ազդում է քարոզի վրա։
Expository preaching is about and minor ideas of your sermon.
Քարոզի հիմնական եւ երկրորդական գաղափարը հիմնելն է, հա, հիմնական տեքստի վրա։
But there's not just one form of expository preaching.
Բայց չկա մի մեկ բացատրական քարոզի
exposing or revealing what is contained in the text.
Քանի որ բացատրական քարոզը բացելն է, ցույց տալն է թե ինչ է գտնվում տեքստում եւ կիրառել դա կյանքի։
So often we'll say, okay, yeah, the literary genre is going to affect how I study the text. And yes, at minimum, it should affect how you study the text. You do not have the right to see in the text what the original readers would not have seen in the text without a good reason. Now, why do I add without a good reason? When it comes to some prophetic text, the people that were writing it knew that it wasn't applying to them, as the New Testament teaches us, but was applying to a future generation.
Օրինակ որոշ մարգարեական տեքստերում այդ մարդիկ ում որ գրված էր իրենք հասկանում են որ դա իրենց չի վերաբերվում բայց ինչպես նոր կտակարանում ասում այդ հաջորդ սերունդների համար.
So they would have not seen the full meaning that we can see today after Christ has come.
Իրենք չեն կարող տեսնել ամբողջական իմաստը ոնց որ մենք կարող ենք հա Քրիստոսի գալուստից հետո.
But still the basic meaning that they would have seen
հիմնական
is where we must start from.
Որը որ իրենք կտեսնեն մեր համար սկզբնակետը.
When you had hermeneutics, you studied the basic principle. The Bible cannot mean today what it did not mean then.
Hermeneutika հիմնական գաղափարը Աստծաշունչը այսօր չի կարող նշանակի մի բան, որ չէր նշանակում այն ժամանակ.
We need to pay attention not just to what is revealed,
but how God.
A part of that goes back to our basic assumptions as conservative evangelicals. We don't just believe that God passed along certain ideas, but the grammar and the details don't matter. I don't believe that God dictated every word, but I do believe that God motivated people to write using different styles because he wanted it in that style. If God left me his word in that form, I think I'm obligated to try to understand that form. And so that genre really winds up impacting how we deal with words and phrases and things like that. Some people will take a narrative text which telling what happened and they'll turn it into an allegory. Now, narratives have a lesson for us. But all those details are supposed to be taken together to see that one lesson. Same thing with the parables of Jesus. They're not allegories. The Psalms were designed to create an overall picture and an overall impression. But you can over-exegete the particular details of a psalm.
Այս չափից շատ կարող է սա էգզեգետիկայով զբաղվել, որը
And you
սաղմոսների
start seeing
դետալների
things that the psalm writer never intended.
Ու սկսում ես տեսնել բաներ, որ սաղմոսի հեղինակը երբեք չի ունեցել մտքում։
Psalms 23.
Այնակ Սաղմոս 23-ը։
The whole thing is about the Lord's care for his people.
Իմաստը տիրոջ հոգատարություն մասներ ժողովրդի համար։
But there's some words in there like, I shall not want.
Yes, չեմ ցանկանում։
Leads me beside the still water.
Նա ինձ հանդեր ջրերի մոտ է
The picture of grass.
այդ խոտերի մոտ տանում ինձ։
And some commentators will go, oh,
որոշ մեկնաբաններ
this is referring to the children of Israel in the wilderness.
Սա վերաբերում է Իսրայելի որդիներին։
They never wanted.
Իրենք երբեք կարիք չունեն։
God fed them all the time.
Աստված ամեն ժամանակ իրենց կերակուր էր
He gave them the water.
ջուր էր տալիս։
That's not what that psalm is about. It's not about what happened in the wilderness. It's about a shepherd and his sheep. And he used the shepherd and sheep not to remind you of the wilderness, but to talk about shepherd and sheep. So you have to be careful not to see something that's not there. Now, the hard part for us is it really should modify the way that we preach some of these genres. It's not going, I'll tell you what, it's not going to change. Regardless of the genre, you do need to understand the main theme that text is talking about. You need to understand the text. Where does it start? Where does it end? It's not going to change how we look for logical blocks to find the text. It's not going to affect how we look for the overall theme that's talked about there. We still want to have the big idea. We still want to have that main idea, that main thought we're expressing. And we still want to call people to concrete action, change. Those things don't change. It will change often how we do our introduction and conclusion. Narrative texts often don't need much of an introduction. You just explain what's the context. They may not need as much of a conclusion. And the big thing that it will impact is how many points we have in the middle of our sermon and what they are. So does it change the way we do a theme? No. Does it change the way we do the text? No. Does it change the way we do our big idea or our thesis? No. Does it change our call to action or purpose for preaching? No. Should it impact how we structure our points? Yes. Will it change? Will we not need to use transition sentences? Yeah, we still need to use transition sentences. But their function will change a little bit. So, no, none. You don't need to throw out the basic approach I taught you. Your key word is modify. You don't delete, you modify. You're a redactor, you're an editor. You're not writing something new. I hope that, does that make sense so far? Okay, let's look at 46. They do have the slides, right?
Yeah.
Okay. He does have it. Okay.
He doesn't actually.
Oh, you don't?
I've sent it.
You forgot. a break, you might want to open them up. It's up to you.
And the next session he will.
Okay.
Just can't find them now.
That's perfectly fine. The emphasis and effects created by text genre should be included in the sermon.
And շեշտադրում ու էֆեկտները and աստեցությունը որ տեքստը տալիս է պիտի քարոզի մեջ ներառված լինի.
For instance, when you're working with a narrative text,
Օրինակ, եթե աշխատում ես պատմական տեքստի հետ,
you really want to try to pull those people into that event.
Մարդկանց ուզում ես ներառել այդ պատմության մեջ.
You're not just trying to say this is what it teaches.
But
you're trying to pull them in so that they're standing by those characters. They're feeling what they feel. You remember when we studied Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch last week? That's what I did. I tried to pull you into that story. I drew your attention to specific things that happen. But that passage is such that I couldn't use a lot of points. I needed to walk you through and see two things. How God prepared Philip to speak and how he prepared the eunuch to hear. Now, yesterday, the narrative text we worked with has within itself structure. This is what happens before Barnabas comes. This is what happens when Barnabas comes. This is what happens when Paul gets there. And this is what happens in the other two chapters. So, why did I use 4 points? Because it divides logically into 4 different episodes, 4 different parts of that story. But when I preached it, what did I do? I walked you through the details of the text, of what's happening, so that you could feel yourself being there. Don't know if I did that well, but that was my goal. When we present this genre, it really can. We often preach to the head. But some of these genres are designed more to appeal to the emotions. And as we use different genres over an extended period of time, we can appeal to the whole person. This text we appeal more to. In this text, we appeal more to the emotions and the will. The next time, more to the mind. In the sermons of the prophets, there is an explanation of God. You know, the doctrine of God, the doctrine of the Father is there. The doctrine of Trinity is there. But his characters is explained to call people to make right decisions. It's good in a prophetic passage to talk about what is God like in this passage. You haven't preached that passage. You preach part of that passage. So it's talking about God's character, how to achieve. And so, bottom line, it actually 2 things. One, if you start paying attention to the genre, preaching can be more fun. Because you're going, oh, I didn't see that before. And it also, for the people that you're training to preach, certain genres will be closer to their heart.
Որը ժանրեր ավելի մոտիկ կլինեն իրենց սրտին, քան մյուսները։
You know, you have right brain, left brain people.
Ունենք չա ուղեղի աջ ցախ
Analytical, creative.
ավելի կրեատիվ ու վերլուծող։
Creative people like the prophets and creative people like the Psalms.
Կրեատիվ մարդիկ սիրում են օրինակ մարգարեներին ու սաղմոսները։
They really like Daniel and Revelation.
Իրենց դուր շատ է գալիս Դանիելը ու Հայտնության
There's all these images.
Լիքը պատկերներ կան այնտեղ։
And just love it.
Ուղղակի սիրում են դրանք։
Matthew is their favorite gospel.
Մատթեոս իրենց սիրելի ավետարանն է։
He's a tax collector. He's an accountant.
Հաշվապահ, հարկավակ եղել։
For some of those people,
Այդպիսի մարդկանց համար
First John drives him crazy.
Առաջին Հովհաննեսը խնդացնում է նրանց։
Because he talks about this and then he talks about this and then he talks about this and then he comes back to this.
Բանի համար հետո հետ է գալիս։
And they're going, come on, just stop, talk about it.
Կանգնի խոսա, մի քիչ վերջացրել։
Especially drives Americans crazy.
Նամանավանդ ամերիկացիները։
Ukrainians not so much. They like to chase bunny rabbits all over the place. Another thing, James, if you don't understand the structure of that whole book, you can pick out verses and preach heresy. Analytical people really don't like the symbols in the book of Revelation because they think it's the revelation of the chronology of the end times. But it's called in the text the revelation of Jesus Christ. And the basic theme, I think, is to simply say Jesus wins. No matter how bad it gets, Jesus wins. And you win with him. People who want to make the charts, they don't want it to be as symbolic as it is. Analytical people don't like the Psalms. Creative people love the Psalms. So it's just, we have to, some of you people, I can't figure out yet what Hosra will like to preach. I haven't figured out if he's creative or analytical. I've already figured out None is dobrая смесь. So we have to ask ourselves some questions. You open this text up. You have to ask yourself some questions. What is the genre of this text? I hope by the time we get done this week, you'll at least have a short list of possible biblical genres. And you go, where's that list from Dan? Oh, okay. Is it a parable? Is it a proverb? I know those are yes. Yeah. Same word in Armenian. Yeah. And is it an Old Testament proverb? Is it narrative? Is it teaching? Is it poetry? There's not a long list. It's less than 10. I'm hoping you'll be able to pull that out and go, okay, which one of these is it? And why is this truth expressed in this way? Why did God choose to use this genre? As I already mentioned, I think for the most part, different genres prioritize thinking, feeling, and choosing in different orders. So there's a greater emphasis on at least two of those functions normally. Prophetic literature, definitely addressed to the will, repent. Then in second place, I would put as a tie between understanding and emotions.
Երկրորդում կասեի հավասար է, հա, հասկացողության հասկացումների մեջ։
Jonah goes into Nineveh.
Հովնանը գնում է Նինվե։
He wants those people to be scared.
Ուզում է որ այդ մարդիկ վախենան։
Often the prophets want people to have an emotional reaction of fear before the Lord.
Մարդիկ ներողություն մարգարեները ցանկանում են որ ժողովուրդը ունենան այդ
sinning.
Վախի տիրոջ։
We're guilty and we will be punished. Ezekiel is a little different. Ezekiel wants to give hope. He's talking to people who've already Babylonian captivity started. They're stuck living in Babylon. They're going to be there 70 years. And he's one prophet that starts to give you more hope. It's bad. Jeremiah adds some hope, 70 years. They're definitely going to be taken into Babylonian captivity, but 70 years. Different things about that. What genre is it? Why is it used? What is it trying to accomplish? Are there internal tactics or devices that are used? The structure of the text, metaphor, simile, parallelism. Is something pictured as much worse than it probably is, or much better than it probably is? Exaggeration. Not exaggeration to the point of lie. Jesus said it's easier for a rich man to be saved is like a camel going through the eye of the needle. Either way you interpret that word needle, this is a wild picture in your head. For the purpose of saying it's hard. He could have said, oh, it's hard. But he used this comparison so that you go, wow, that really is hard. So it's for a special effect. Says to the Pharisees that you're a bunch of snakes, you're a brood of vipers. He could have said you're bad people. Brood of vipers has a different effect. So it's designed to communicate, and sometimes it's just said straight up. Sometimes it uses a certain way of expressing it to kind of shock you a little bit. There are even some interesting studies that have come out in the last 20 years where they discuss how much sarcasm did Jesus use in his original context. Now, Jewish sarcasm is different than Armenian or American sarcasm. It's interesting reading where some of those guys who are experts in the mindset of first century Jews point out the sarcasm that would have been there.
Իրենց մտածելակերպն էին, մտածելակերպի մեջ են խորացել էքսպերտ են, ինչպես էին մտածում հրեաները առաջի տարի, իրենք գտնում են այդ սարկազմի
սիաստ. Jesus tells the parable of the man and his workers that sowed the field.
Օրինակ Հիսուսը պատմում են առակը, որ մեկը արտում էր, այդ արտի մեջ իր աշխատողները ցանում են, սերմեն ցանում.
And the enemy comes in at night
եւ գիշերը չար մաղ
and sows the weeds. That was something that the people that lived in an agricultural setting they wouldn't have just heard and went, they would have been mad at these people that came in at night. Their reaction would have been, how could they do that? And they did it at night.
Գիշեր
They were so sneaky.
խորանանք
And he's adding details
դետալներ
to
ավելացնում
pull people into what he's saying and
մարդկանց
to produce an effect.
հաշելու է իրենց պատմության մեջ ինչ որ էֆեկտ առաջացնելու իրենց
How in particular does the text that we're studying,
ինչպես է այն տեքստը որ մենք սովորում ենք
how does it show those first three things that we've just talked about?
ինչպես է ցույց տալիս այս երեք բաները
The
որ
text,
խոսեցինք
the purpose of using that genre in the text,
ժանրը եւ այդ ժանրի տեքստի մեջ օգտագործվելու նպատակը
other internal tactics or methods that are used,
ուրիշ ներքին տակտիկաներ մեթոդներ որ օգտագործվում են
and that is all taken from a book that's called Text-Driven Preaching about expository preaching.
Սա վերցված է տեքստով առաջնորդված քարոզ, հա, որը առանցին գիրք է բացատրական քարոզ տալու մասին։
Okay. Now, here's your list, Hovnan.
Ահա ցուցակը հովնան։
We have narratives,
Ունենք պատմողական
Old Testament, New Testament narratives.
5 տակարան եւ նոր տակարան։
Okay, in the Old Testament,
5 տակարան։
which books have the most narratives in them?
Որ գրքերը ունեն ավելի շատ նարատիվներ իրենց մեջ։ Պատմողական, հա, ժանրով
I'm not just saying they only have narratives, but they have more narratives than
միայն, հա, պատմողական ձևավորված են տեղ, բայց ամենաշատը որ այդ գրքի մեջ գրված է այդպես։ Genesis.
And
like the Pentateuch, we could say.
Okay. List me the books in your Armenian Bible in the order that they're in the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. What comes next? You have First and Second Samuels, or do you call that Kings?
Yeah,
in English, it's First Samuel, Second Samuel.
Yeah, it's four.
You have 4 kings. Okay, First, Second, Third, Fourth Kings. What's after that?
The Chronicles.
What's after that?
But there's Book of Joshua.
Yeah, Joshua. We forgot him.
Esther.
Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther.
Yeah, Esther, Job.
Do you know why they're in that order?
That's
the historical books of the Old Testament. So in them, you're going to find more narrative. Not only narrative, but you're going to find more narrative. New Testament, what 5 books contain more narrative than any others? Just 5 of them. And
Book of Acts.
In the Book of Acts. That's where you're going to find most of your narratives. The historical books of the Old Testament and those narratives. Now, they will have other things in them, but their overall structure is a story, chronology, narrative structure. Okay. Does that make sense? What was your question?
Այս chronology-ն որ գրածել է, դա լավ ցույց տալիս որ which we have the Bible. So it's ինչ նկատի ունես։
Այսինքն այդ ծննդոց ելից գետացի թվոց այդ հերթականություն որ ասեց,
ժամանակագրական հերթականություն նկատի ունես։
Այսինքն այդ դոկտորը ուզում էր ասել, այս փաստում է այն պատմական ժանրը։
That I understand that it also speaks about the chronology order in which they're placed.
Narratives by nature are chronological.
I think what he meant was like
yes, they're basically the Old Testament books are largely in the chronological order that it happened. In the Pentateuch, that's the order that it happened. And Joshua came after the Pentateuch. Judges came after Joshua. First Kings came before Second Kings. And the 4 kings are largely in order. Chronicles is a bit different.
Մնացորդածը մի փոքր տարբեր է,
because it relates to a part of the period described in the Kings.
որովհետև թագավորների թագավորացի ժամանակահատվածի հետ է կապված։
For the most part, Chronicles starts with Saul and goes to the Babylonian.
Մնացորդածը Սավողից եւ գնում է մինչեւ Բաբելոնյան գերություն։
Now, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther.
Եզրաս Նեհեմիա Էսթեր
Ezra and Nehemiah was originally one book.
Եզրաս Նեհեմիան ի սկզբանե մի գիրք է։
Esther, we know, occurred in the Persian time.
Էսթեր գիտենք, որ Պարսից թագավորության ժամանակ է եղել,
but we don't know exactly where does it fall in the Ezra Nehemiah chronology.
Եզրաս Նեհեմիայի հերթականության մեջ որտեղ է ընկնում։
But we know it was in that same general period.
Գիտենք այդ ընդհանուր հիմնական ժամանակահատվածում տեղի ունեցել։
The prophets are not in strictly chronological order.
Մարգարեները տենց խիստ ժամանակագրական հերթականությամբ դրված չեն,
because you have the major prophets which
մեծ մարգարեները,
they're only major in the fact that their books are longer.
Մեծ մարգարեներն են առնում, որ իրենց գրքերը ավելի
and you have the minor prophets.
ունեն ավելի փոքր մարգարեները։
The major prophets are overall in chronological order.
Մեծ մարգարեները ընդհանուր առմամբ
Isaiah, Jeremiah,
roughly
in that order.
Yes, and
Ezekiel, Daniel and Ezekiel. We know it's Babylonian Empire, but they overlap roughly in chronological order. The minor prophets are overall in chronological order. Malachi is definitely the last one. By chronology, not just by list. So, so that kind of helps us a little bit. I hope. Okay, is it a narrative? Narratives describe events. Narratives describe what happened. Now we'll talk about this more, but what you need to realize, narratives do not always describe what should have happened or what should happen. They describe what did happen. The Old Testament describes good kings and bad kings. The bad kings are not an example of how you should live your life. They're a good example of how not to live. The Israelites not going into the promised land is a narrative. But that's not a good example of how we should live. It's an example of disobedience. The interesting thing too, in narratives, they're not pictured like in typical hero stories. This is not Batman, Superman. The people who are described in those narratives are not perfect, and their faults are described. Moses, great hero, right? Does he get to go into the promised land? Why? He gets mad and he beats the rock. He was supposed to touch it or command it. He beats it. So he gets to look at the promised land, but he can't go in. To me, that's one of the saddest sections in Moses' life. So you also have teaching or didactic sections. Now these can be pure books. They can be books themselves that are primarily teaching books. The epistles. Epistles, the letters of Paul, the letters of all the other guys. They are designed to teach. The Sermon on the Mount. the description of the Ten Commandments in Exodus and in Deuteronomy.
10 պատվիրանների ներկայացումը Ելից եւ Երրորդ օրինաց
They're teaching sections
իրենք ուսուցման հատվածներ
about the principles of how you're to live.
Այն սկզբունքների թե ինչպես պիտի ապրես
You have poetry.
Ունենք պոեզիա
Um,
հաջորդ ժանրն ասա
Psalms, Proverbs,
Սաղմոսներ
Ecclesiastes.
Արաքներ ժողովող
Your favorite book, Song of Solomon,
սիրած գիրքը երկերքոտ
and Job.
եւ Հոբը
They are structured according to poetic forms.
իրենք պոետիկա տեսքով են իրենք
Now, Job looks like a narrative,
գրված Հոբը թվում է թե նա
but it's structured like a narrative.
բայց այսյան
And that Job, for me,
ինձ համար
is
Հոբը
one of the most difficult Old Testament books to preach
ամենաբարդ հինգտականային գրքերից է քարոզելու առումով
because it takes so much time to make the one point.
շատ ժամանակ է հա պետք է մի կետ
The point is pretty clear.
հիմնական իմաստը հստակ է
Sometimes good people suffer,
երբեմն լավ մարդիկ տառապում են
and we don't always know the reason why.
չգիտենք պատճառը միշտ թե ինչու
And we know
մենք գիտենք
because the narrator describing it tells us that this was, Satan wanting to attack Job.
պատմողը հա հստակ ներկայացնում է որ սա սատանան էր որ ուզում էր Հոբին
Job didn't know that when he was going through it.
բայց Հոբը չգիտար դա այդ ամենը միջով
And then God says, I'm God, you're man.
Եվ հետո վերջում Աստված ասում է ես Աստված եմ
And
դու
Job says, okay. I trust you.
ասում դելա վստահում եմ քեզ
So the book of Job raises more questions for a lot of people than it solves.
Հոբի գիրքը մարդկանց շատ մարդկանց մոտ ավելի շատ
But it's
հարցեր է
poetry.
առաջացնում
It's not designed to give us all the answers.
Բայց այն պոեզիա է եւ չի նախատեսված
It's designed to help us feel the pain of Job
ահա զգանք Հոբի ցավը
because of his bad situation and his bad friends.
իր վատ իրավիճակի ու վատ ընկերների պատճառով այն ցավը շատ կար
Old Testament Proverbs, oh my goodness.
5 տակարանի առակները
These are so fun.
այնքան հավես են
That book is a mess in terms of structure.
կարասեցի առումով խառնաշփոթ է
You have a few blocks where you've got where context matters.
Կոնտեքստը կարևոր է
In the book of Proverbs,
առակած գրքում
context matters less than in any other book of the Bible. Here's talking wife, and now he's talking about something else. It's a collection of wise sayings.
Այդ ուղղակի իմաստուն
And I
ասացվածքների
think I already told you, and we'll talk about this when we get there. It's very hard to teach an expository sermon
բարդ է
in the classic form on Proverbs.
Classic բացատրական քարոզտաց
Now you can do Exodus,
զբաղվել հա ուրեմն
you have to kind of study all the verses talking about a particular theme in Proverbs.
պետք է ուսումնասիրես բոլոր հատվածները բոլոր համարները որ կոնկրետ ինչ որ
And then come to an overall understanding of what Proverbs teaches about that theme.
Ընդհանուր հասկացողություն գաս թե
Pick a few verses
այդ ընտրես որոշ համարներ
that describe various aspects of that theme.
որ այդ թեմայի տարբեր ասպեկտներն են ներկայացնում
Study those particular verses in depth.
խորությամբ ուսումնասիրես այդ հատվածները այդ համարները
But in the end, you're going to preach a thematic sermon.
Քո քարոզինելու թեմատիկ
There are very few passages in Proverbs that you can preach a verse by verse sermon.
շատ քիչ հատվածներ կան առակացումը կարող ես
I've seen people try to do that,
քարոզել
and it's a mess.
մարդիկ
It's just crazy.
խառնաշփոթացրածում իրականում
Tim Keller wrote a book on Proverbs.
Թիմ Քելերը գիրքը գրել է առակացի մասին
Tim Keller loved to do verse by verse stuff.
եւ նա սիրում էր համար
That
տեսուսնասիրությունները
book is a thematic study of Proverbs. Very good study.
իր գիրքը թեմատիկ ուսումնասիրություն է
But our goal in the end
Մենք
is not so much about do we go verse by verse,
Այնչի որ արդյոք համարային գնում
but do we pull people into the biblical text?
Արդյոք մարդկանց տանում են
Do we study the biblical text with them
արդյոք
to
սովորում
come to our conclusions?
տեքստ իրենց հետ որպես իրանք եզրակացություն
New Testament parables,
նոր կտակարանի
they're
առակները
not allegories.
Իրենք ալեգորիաներ չեն,
They're designed primarily to teach one lesson.
Իրենց նպատակն է մեկ ուսուցում տալ,
The Good Samaritan.
բարի սամարացին,
Now, context matters with parables.
Հիմա առակների հետ, Հիսուսի առակների դեպքում կոնտեքստը կապ ունի։
The parable of the Good Samaritan was spoken because someone said, well, who is my neighbor?
Օրինակ, բարի սամարացու առակը տրվել է, որտեղ ինչ-որ մեկը հարցրեց, իսկ ով է իմ դրացին, չէ։
And the whole parable is told for one purpose.
Ամբողջ առակը մի նպատակով է ասում։
Quit worrying about who's your neighbor and just be a neighbor to everybody you encounter. Intellectual discussion, it's like, come on, Chuvak, quit doing this. Just accept the fact. You're supposed to be a neighbor. And then we also have prophecy and apocalyptic. And apocalyptic is a little bit like prophecy,
but
it's a little bit like Psalms because it has a lot of imagery. And you have books like the book of Daniel. First half is narrative. Second half is apocalyptic vision. Overall categories, and sometimes an entire book of the Bible will fit neatly into one category. Primarily into one category. But it may contain passages that are of a different genre. So that's where we start. We go, okay, what is this genre? Why was it used? How is it structured? And then we begin to try to study those genres. So far, any questions?
Can you see if Google is there to add anything?
Okay.
In genre
Being recorded. Martin is in. No request.
And I think there's no request. Like at this point, they can just.
They should be able to just go right in without a request. But
okay.
And if there is a request, Jonah can. He's in.
There he is.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yep. He's from St. Petersburg, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
okay.
Ախպեր հարցերը
Դոկտորը վերջում դրասեց, չէ, վերջում ամփոփեց արգակին ժանրը, ինչի մասին է, ինչ կառուցված է, մի քանի բաներ քննարկեց։
Some questions he wants to know those questions.
Yeah, they're in the slides, but one is what genre is this?
In genre it's hesa.
Why do you think this genre was used?
Ինչու է օգտագործվել է ժանրը?
And what is
նպատակով է օգտագործվել է ժանրը այս տեքստում?
More specifically,
ավելի կոնկրետ,
does this genre
արդյոք այս ժանրը
appeal more to the mind, the will, or the emotions?
Այս երեքից որին է ավելի աշխատացնում, հա, միտքը, զգացմունքները, թե կամքը?
And inside of this passage,
այս հատվածի մեջ,
what other tactics, approaches are used to produce this effect that we just talked about? And we listed several. It can be a simile, it can be a metaphor, it can be parallelism. Those are tactics that are used within a genre. And they're actually used within parallelism, for instance. Is used in more than one genre.
այդ մեթոդը հա գործիքը օգտագործում է մի
It's
ժանրի
used in Proverbs and it's also used in
առակաց գրքում
the Psalms.
սալմոսներով
So, what genre are we dealing with?
ինչ ժանրի հետ գործում
Why is this truth expressed through this genre?
ինչու է ճշմարտությունը այստեղ արտահայտվում է
Third,
ժանրի միջոցով
what are the-
երրորդը
Specific tactics, methods that are used inside of this genre to produce that effect.
ինչ կոնկրետ տակտիկաներ կամ մեթոդներ են օգտագործում այս ժանրում, հա, որպեսզի տան այդ էֆեկտը։
Does that make sense?
Հասկանալի է։
Okay, let's take our first 20-minute break.
Առաջի ընդմիջը վերցնենք 20
Oh.
minutes.
The brother from St. Petersburg just got in. I guess we'll still take our break and he can come back
Мир вам,
in.
братья. Мир вам.
Mir.
Ստրես։
Надо Дэн.
Դոկտոր ինչ ասում։
Չանոց։
Yeah. Let's go ahead and do our 20-minute break and we'll come back. Okay.
Բուրգեր ջան, ընդմիջը
That's
ենք
okay.
անում հիմա, տենց 20 րոպե կվերադառնանք։
We'll be back in 20 minutes.